Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome to the museum. My name is Costa Petridis. I'm the curator of Arts of Africa and chair of the Department of the Arts of Africa. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here, and a special shout out to the students from the University of Notre Dame who joined us today for this lecture and a visit of the exhibition. This is indeed the last lecture that is organized in conjunction with our temporary exhibition, The Language of Beauty in African Art, which showcases about 255 objects coming from various parts of West, Central, and Southern Africa, and highlighting local indigenous concepts of beauty and its opposite, ugliness, through the languages and the visions and perspectives of the cultures, specifically their makers, their art critics, their patrons and audiences. So I do hope that if you haven't had a chance, that this lecture today will incite you to go and visit the exhibition and explore the many objects that are on view there until February 27th. So we have a few weeks left. And hopefully you'll make the time to go and see the show. Today it is my great pleasure to welcome here to the stage Nii Quarcoopome, a dear colleague from a neighboring institution, the Detroit Institute of Arts, where since 2000 he occupies the position of curator of African art, but also department head of Africa, Oceania, and the Indigenous Americas. Nii came to the United States in 1979 in order to study art history at UCLA in Los Angeles, the University of California, Los Angeles, where he obtained his PhD in 1993, working on cultures from his own native Ghana, their art specifically, the Ewe, the Dagma, the Ga. Today, he will be talking about Akan art and aesthetics, and specifically objects of gold. But before I invite him to the stage, let me also tell you that for a number of years, Nii, after graduating, was a professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And then after having become the curator of African art in Detroit, he, for 4 years, between 2012 and 2016, combined his position in Detroit with that of curator of African art at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. And then he's the recipient of numerous awards and recognitions, including from the Getty Research Institute, from the National Museum of African Art, from the Smithsonian in DC, and also grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, widely published, most notably perhaps a memorable and claimed exhibition called Through African Eyes, about the European in the arts of Africa from 1500 to the present, that his main home institution, Detroit, organized back in 2010 with a catalog that he edited and numerous contributions. And before this glamorous career in Detroit, while he was still in Ann Arbor, he actually also wrote an essay in a publication from our own institution on our own collection of Akan gold and other art forms, here published in the now defunct series Museum Studies back in 1997. And then among his many awards, most recently, and I hope that you're okay with me mentioning it, you would see it as soon as you look for him on the website, along with some YouTube films and interviews as well. Nii was appointed as an advisor to the Cultural Property Advisory Committee that was launched by President Biden, and that was one of his most recent recognitions, and he serves on that committee since a few, I think, years or months. But in any case, at this point, I'm very glad to welcome Nii to the stage. You will have an opportunity during the last 10 minutes or so to ask questions. And one final practical note, this lecture and the Q&A will be recorded, and you will be able to see it again and again and again on our YouTube channel. So with that, thank you very much for being here, and Nii, welcome to the stage.
Thank you all for coming this afternoon to listen to an African who thought Chicago is too cold. And I also want to thank Costa for inviting me to speak here, and the Art Institute of Chicago for welcoming me here. I have been treated so well, I will keep coming back. And I also wanted to make clear that the DIA, which is the Detroit Institute of Arts, has recently closed a major show on Van Gogh. And I'm mentioning Van Gogh here because every time I spoke with people, I always told them that the DIA's Van Gogh has brought together objects that you will not find anywhere else again until somebody is able to bring them out of private collections to show to the world. And that is why I can't emphasize enough why you should go through this exhibition here at the Art Institute of Chicago, because it's a special exhibition with so many objects coming from private collections that you may never see again, unless Costa decides to stay on here for another century. Okay. I would like to start my lecture. I'm told I have only 40 minutes to speak, and I am going to try as much as possible to stay within the time frame. I would like to begin by saying that Ghana's history is inextricably linked with gold. Since at least the 15th century, the country has been defined by its endowment of gold. The British called it the Gold Coast Colony before it became independent in 1957. And the World Bank, at one point, in one of its reports, said that Ghana has enough gold to produce 2 million ounces every year for the next 750 years, which tells you a lot about why gold is so important. Yet when it comes to the various cultures of Ghana, none exemplifies the commingling of gold use, philosophy, and statecraft like the Akan people. In this talk, I will offer a general introduction to the complex gold art of the Akan, paying particular attention to their varied displays, context, materiality, and significance. I examine gold use in its most fundamental personal levels in society, as well as at the highest echelons of political leadership. I will also try to demonstrate how gold not only lends itself to a multiplicity of applications, such as bodily decoration, embellishment of court art, and also as cast secret emblems, but also how gold works in tandem with other elements in the communication of leadership ideology. First, I would like to begin by admitting that when I was asked to give this lecture, I resisted the temptation to focus exclusively on the Asante people, for the sole reason that much of what I am about to speak on also applies to the larger Akan population, of whom the Asante constitutes one subgroup. The term Akan denotes a large cultural group in two countries at the moment. On the Ghana side, the Akan people occupy the southern forest and the western coastal regions, and while on the Ivorian side, which is Ivory Coast, they are in the southeastern section of Ivory Coast. The Akan speak a cluster of dialects belonging to the central Tano branch of the Niger-Congo language family. As a cultural group, the Akan people consist of anywhere between 9 to 16 subgroups, depending on how you count them. Each subgroup speaks its own distinct dialect, but collectively, over the years, they've developed a lingua franca known as Twi that enables them to interact among themselves. One of the most important elements of Akan that identify the Akan culturally is the fact that all of them are matrilineal, in that they trace descent and kinship relationships through the mother's bloodline. They also inherit property and political office the same way. Consequently, Akan people place a premium on females who, through childbirth, ensure the continuity of not only the family, but also society. Most crucially, for our purposes today, Akan people are also best known for their long tradition of developing centralized political systems based on the rule of secular chiefs. In pre-colonial Akan society, gold was widely available, and ownership was unrestricted because the medium was not exclusive to leadership. Its application as personal ornament was very, very widespread. In fact, European visitors to the Akan coast, wait a minute, I think, hold on a second. Europeans noted that Akan people used gold, nuggets, and jewelry affixed to their hair and scalp, and we see it in pre-20th century terracotta sculptures, which European travelogues also, European travelogues also describe, and also produced sketches of Akan people dressed this same way, that is, using jewelry in their hair. It appears that gold took on such profound sociological significance that ordinary objects like protective charms, suman, otherwise rendered in base materials, also began to be reproduced and displayed in gold. One of the things that I also wanted to draw your attention to is the fact that the location of the Akans today in the forest region, which you see in this section of Ghana and also the adjoining area in Côte d'Ivoire, seems to coincide with the bearing rocks formation on the Ghanaian side at least. And that is quite significant because it means that the Akan naturally are sitting on an area that is very, very, very wealthy in gold. That forest region has long been the location of Akan prospecting for gold. They've been mining gold by panning alluvial soils from the riverbeds and also through shallow surface mining. It should therefore come as no surprise that gold has for centuries played a crucial role in Akan culture. Another issue that I would like to bring to your attention is the fact that gold was what attracted the Mandingo traders who braved the Sahara Desert and came southward into Akan territory to buy gold. So most of the Mandingo people lived here, and they were middle people in the trans-Saharan trade, and they actually acted as middle people with the Akan people who were on this side of the west coast of Africa. So the Mandingo, up to between at least 1300 and 1500, were instrumental in bringing the Akan people within the orbit, the commercial orbit of the international trans-Saharan trade. And then, after 1500, when Europeans also came to the coast of Ghana from Portugal, the Portuguese made contact with the coast of Ghana in 1470. Right after the Portuguese made that contact, they actually started a trade, a very, very lucrative trade with the Akan people, especially the Fantis along the coast. And that alone caused the demise of the contacts with the northern Mandingo people. So as you can see here, gold occurred in what we call gold dust, which are grains, and then it also occurred as nuggets. And gold dust and nuggets were the main materials that people actually carried with them. Because gold was a medium of exchange, just about everybody who could afford it had it. But gold was also a metal that had intrinsic value. It was wealthy by itself. It was wealth by itself. And as a result, it was considered a store of wealth. Gold accumulation also therefore became a means by which people became very, very powerful in Akan culture. Because of the importance of gold and the fact that it was so instrumental in the trade, at least from about 1300 until 1500, and also beyond, gold developed, there was a whole artistic culture that developed around the use of gold itself. As you can see here, this paraphernalia here would have been something that any Akan gold trader would have owned. The pieces that you see here are brass castings, and these brass cast objects were used as counterweights for weighing gold that was used in the trade. You have the scales and other implements, including the ladles that were used for scooping the gold dust. But what is interesting is how the Akan adopted this system here, which came from the North African Arab traders, how the Akan adopted this and transformed it into figurative elements. So over time, by the 19th century, the Akans were using both the geometric forms that you see here and the figurative forms that you see here. And so the figurative forms are, specifically Akan creations. In addition, the Akan also developed containers, really, really beautiful containers with figurative elements on top of them that were part of the whole paraphernalia associated with the trade. What is very important for us to keep in mind is how the imagery, the figurative imagery that were developed, what was developed associated with the gold trade, had proverbial significance. Most of the animal images, as well as human forms that were created, for use as counterweights, were objects that had meanings associated with proverbs. And therefore, when people sat down to trade, it wasn't just a transaction, it was also a conversation. It was also the sharing of philosophies, was also something that the Akan considered very, very important in establishing human relationships. As I said earlier, Europeans were able to, started documenting Akans wearing gold nuggets in the hair, as well as designed gold objects. And some of these were actually carefully documented by the Frenchman Babot, for instance, did exquisite drawings of the individual components that were strung together and used for that purpose. And you can actually see this gold chain here, which contains some of the elements that you see here and documented in 1759 by Babot. But you can also see from the gold mask here, the maskets here that comes from the DIS collection, that the actual gold nuggets and figurative forms, perhaps, were tied to the human head and also decorated the scalp. And you see it in terracotta sculptures that come from pre-20th century terracotta sculptures that were used to memorialize the important people in Akan culture. One of the things that is critical in our discussion today has to do with the fact that ownership of gold was unrestricted in Akan culture. And as I said earlier, because of the lack of leadership control of gold, its application in personal ornament was fashionable long before it entered leadership circles. One of the areas that usually don't get communicated in the scholarship is the fact that we don't have evidence of the use of gold to rub the skin. And you can see in this young lady in the center especially how gold dust is used on the skin. And one of the objects that is on display in this exhibition that you have at the Art Institute of Chicago actually has one such sculpture that has gold rubbed on this surface. And it has traces of gold, it has traces of silver, which is amazing because frequently you don't get objects with that kind of treatment. But the last section here, and the third slide, shows an Asante lady wearing a profusion of gold objects around the neck, around the arms, wristlets, and also even false brassiere or whatever breasts, fake breasts on a ceremonial occasion, and it tells you how important gold is at the family level, because among Akan families, it is normal on ceremonial occasions, such as puberty rites, celebration, sometimes on festival occasion, to have families with young girls, parading through the streets with these kinds of, beautiful decoration on their bodies as a way to showcase the wealth of the family, It is very, very important for us at this stage to talk about why gold became so important in Akan society. First of all, gold is considered a spirit. And I'll come to that shortly. It is associated with the sun. It radiates power. It has regenerative power because when you unearth an old gold jewelry, you can always bring it back to life. But the physical properties of gold is that gold gives visibility to every object that it touches. It is indestructible. It alludes to, metaphorically, to the permanence of leadership itself. Gold is also malleable and lends itself to diverse uses. And because the metal is rare, because the metal is rare, its abundance in display is conspicuous consumption of wealth, as by Akan standards. Gold's radiance also lends itself to its aesthetic appeal, and it is compatible with just about everything. And the reason why I'm bringing these things up is that as we move from personal use of gold to leadership use of gold, it becomes very, very clear to us why the Akan embrace gold use, not just for its as a reflection of wealth, but for other reasons, which I'm about to deal with right now. One of which is the fact that Akan people, as I said earlier, are among the Ghanaian population, the one culture that has produced the most states. They are the ones who are known in history to have been masters of statecraft. They developed centralized political systems, and as early as the 14th century, the first Akan culture known to have developed a state was the Bono. The Bono kingdom was started in 14th century, and it was shortly after that followed by the Fetu kingdom on the coast where the Fanti people are. They were the ones who met the Portuguese when they arrived in the 1470s. But we also have several other Akan groups, the Akwamu Empire, 1630 to 1750. We have the Denchira Kingdom, 1680 to 1700, Achem Kingdom, 1670 to 1750, and then Asante. Asante was the last but the most dominant of all the kingdoms from 1700 to 1900. The impact of Akan state development and the fact that as major states, the Akan were also able to gobble up neighboring states. That expansionism is something that sometimes people overlook when they talk about Akan and gold, because it was what helped the Akan kingdoms to accumulate gold by getting tribute from their neighbors. It was also something that allowed Akan societies to create an ideology of kingship that was founded on gold. propaganda, the propagandistic quality, the propagandistic function of gold was critical to most Akans. And also, as part of statecraft, the Akans developed institutions of leadership and created hierarchies within the leadership. And that also allowed Akans to create more art objects associated with gold. One of the interesting things, too, about the Akan is the fact that their expansionism also brought them in contact with artists from neighboring cultures that were already working gold. Some of these artists were brought into the courts, and they became attached to palaces and worked exclusively sometimes for some palaces. And they also helped to enlarge the pool of knowledge that was available to Akan gold workers. There are several techniques that the Akan have used over the years, and this exposure to other cultures and the expansion of statecraft brought Akan artists gave Akan artists access to knowledge in the lockswag technique, which was used for casting the beautiful bronze head that you see over here. As we go through this lecture, you'll find that I'm going to be making references to some of the gold objects that have been were looted, out of Asante in the late 1900s, late 1800s, and I hope that if you're not going to ask me very difficult questions about restitution, because I can't answer those questions, given my position as a member of the committee for cultural property, of cultural property advices. But one of the things you can see here is, in addition to the lockswag technique, we also have hammered gold. Hammered gold when a positive image on wood or some other object was hammered into a sheet of gold to create these wonderful pieces. Then we have gold being used as inlay. This is actually woven into the gourd. I have never seen any other object in Akan art that equals this really, really exceptional piece. But this is also in the British collection right now. And then you also have gold being used for inlay. This is in the DIS collection. And then sometimes individual beads were cast gold and then strung together as ornaments. And all these techniques were practiced by Akan artists. By the early 1800s, when the British visitor William Bowditch visited the Asante kingdom's capital, Kumasi, he witnessed, when he witnessed, a festival there, he actually saw something that, he devoted quite a substantial amount of space of description to. And the reason for that is because, it is very important for us to note that Asante was perhaps one of the first to be carefully documented by outsiders. Before that, most of the descriptions that we have were descriptions by Europeans who were either visiting very, very briefly on the coast, or Europeans who were living on the coast and were interacting mostly with the Fantis on the coast. So this was the first major encounter with Asante at a time when Asante was at its peak in the early 1800s and represented a major challenge to British power along the Gold Coast. But one of the things that is critical here is the fact that Bowditch actually devotes a lot of attention to all the critical regalia that are represented here in gold. And you can see how painstaking he was, meticulous he was, in showing the elements that decorated, elements of regalia that were embellished with gold. And you can see the emphasis on gold all through. These were all elements that sometimes you can see in today's Akan regalia, especially in Asante. But you see it also across the Akan area, the general Akan population. All the Akan subgroups have these kinds of celebrations. But Asante, in this case, represented what statecraft looked like at the beginning of the 19th century in Akan culture. It is very important for us to note that while all the Akans are sitting on a generally wealthy or well-endowed gold-producing area, not every Akan chief is wealthy. And you can see from the austere regalia that this Akan chief is wearing. He looks even sad when you look at his face. And then you can see how very, very modest the circumstances. And you compare that to this chief on the right, who is wearing this beautiful cloth, and the headgear, the chains around the neck, around, and the armlets, the wristlets, the rings around on the finger, and also even the anklets are all decorated with gold. It is very important for us to note that these kinds of displays are critical in Akan culture because the appearance of the chief reflects the wealth of the entire community. So they don't mind if the chief is spending money to appear wealthy. It is critical because it reflects on the entire community. And this is something that we have to note. And this is just two levels in Akan culture. You have the village level chief sometimes, or a small town chief who doesn't have a lot. You have a big chief who is wearing all the fineries. And then you have the king of Asante himself, wearing all the elements that you can expect of a very, very wealthy chief. I always make the joke that the chief and the king of Asante, when he appears in public, weighed down by gold, it is very, 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 sometimes I imagine somebody shouting fire, and to see how he's going to be able to run, for big. And it is true. I mean, we had the king of Denchira visit and the DIA in the 1990s when I was teaching at the University of Michigan, and he had so much gold on him that he could barely walk, and he had two courtiers actually holding onto his arms, making sure that his arms did not drop. It was also very, very interesting to watch him keep a very stoic face. He looked like he just was enjoying the moment, but he was still suffering. As we say in my language, Oblakwa Fimo, which means that if you are enjoying the fashion statement you are trying to make, you don't cry in pain. So I think that this is very, very important for us when it comes to. And you can see from the fact that there are certain key areas that are targeted by the Akan. You have the headgear, which deals with the head, a very important aspect of the human anatomy. The head is the point where spirits get into the head and spirits come out. It is what defines you as a human being. And the head is also the focus of rituals that help the health of the king. But in addition to that, you have the necklaces. These are necklaces with pendants that also have motifs on them that speak to the power of the kingship. The wristlets and bracelets that the king wears are also intended to communicate messages. But what is also critical is the fact that when you look at the detail of a typical Akan ruler's outfit, you'll see that the headdress, for instance, which is at the top, has got images on them, and some of the images are references to animal forms, and also you have a human form here. The animal forms are actually intended to communicate very, very important proverbs. And that means that it is not just the show of gold, but also the communication through the use of proverbs. This is a representation of a crab on this side, and that representation is actually a reference to the fact that when the crab has got many, many legs, but chooses to move in any direction it feels like. And that means that the king or the chief who is wearing this is comparing himself to the crab. The fact that the crab can change directions anytime, can move in any direction. So there's an element of unpredictability that is associated with the exercise of political power that the king, this particular chief, is trying to allude to. Then, when you look at the fingers, the profusion of gold ornaments on the fingers, you also see that here, these are actually two crocodiles with the same stomach. These are the two heads, and then those are the tails. And that too references a proverb. And the proverb says that when two crocodiles fight over food, when two crocodiles have the same stomach, there is no need for them to fight over food. And so here you can see how the pose of the chief gives visibility to these emblems, these two emblems, and the fact that gold gives visibility to them. And the chief actually makes makes a conscious effort to make sure that everybody who comes close to him sees these emblems. And it is very, very important for us to note that the use of the gold here is supposed to draw attention to the emblems. And the fact that the chief will wave at the public, he will shake the hands of other dignitaries, and then also when he sits in public and people go to bow before his throne, they will actually notice the emblem. And here, the chief is telling everybody in the community that we share a common destiny, we share common aspirations. I might be dressed up nicely, I might be eating well and sleeping well, but it's all for your sake. That is propaganda at its best. And then we also need to look at the aesthetic appeal of gold, its physical beauty. The fact that gold royal objects are designed to individually and collectively project power. Gold's capacity to give visibility to critical regalia, as we've seen, is also crucial in this case. But the very, very important element here is the fact that these individual elements are sometimes capsules of important messages. Some are proverbial messages, but they combine with songs, appellations, and related utterances to complement the visual forms, which complement the visual forms to reinforce the ideology of leadership. It is critical also for us to note the fact that it is not only the person of the ruler that needs to be dressed up. Functionaries in the palace are also very, very important communicators of royal wealth. And one of the key individuals in the palace is the linguist. We say in Ghana that a chief is as good as his linguist. The linguist is the spokesperson of the court. He is the intermediary, one who stands between the chief and his people, one who also stands between the community and the outside world. He is the advisor to the chief. And so if a linguist is bad, it reflects on the entire community. And here you can see that linguists are associated with these remarkable staffs with gold tops, and the staffs usually are blackened at the lowest two-thirds, but the top section is usually plated with gold, and you can see a detail of it over here. The motifs that you see here are also references to proverbs. The one in the center, speaking to the fact that if you climb a good tree, you'll get a push. if you do good things, you get the support of the community. So these are messages that a linguist will carefully select for an occasion, because the top section can be taken off and replaced with others that are in the treasury of the king. And one of the things that is crucial is also the fact that, when you look at the dressing of the linguist, he looks like somebody who is not trying to compete with the king or the chief. He wears very simple garb because it is his rhetorical skills that really comes into play in the public arena. He speaks for the chief. When you go into an Akan court, those of you who have been to Ghana before and have been to an Akan court will realize the fact that when you go into an Akan court, you can't speak to the king or the chief directly. You speak through the linguist. And so I took my African-American friends to a Ghanaian court, and they were sitting there asking questions, and they saw the linguist going to whisper into the king's head and then coming back and responding. And they were asking me, Nii, what the hell is going on here? And I said, you can't speak directly to the king. You have to go through the linguist. And even if the king understands what you are saying, it's the linguist who goes to whisper into his ears. And the king will whisper briefly into the ears of the linguist, but the linguist will come back and speak for 20 minutes. And so you begin to wonder who is the chief, And in Akan culture, we say that, the linguist, therefore, is the one who literally controls the public engagement of the chief. But there are also additional individuals who are very important for the court. And you can see that some of them are sumptuously decorated on ceremonial occasion. And that's largely because they are supposed to reflect the wealth of the court. And their gold also helps to identify the specific offices that they occupy. This is a royal guard. They are called Akrafo. Akrafo are the ones who routinely purify the spirit of the king for the sake of the health of the entire community. And I have an interesting story to tell you. When we purchased this sword at the Detroit Institute of Art, one of our sponsors, one of our major patrons, gave us this piece. It's been in the collection for a while. And I decided to buy this headdress, and she freaked out. She said it was not art. And it was only when I explained to her that these three go together that she finally calmed down. The fact is that some of these items that you see here are supposed to work in tandem with each other. And gold also gives visibility to the individual objects, but the three work together. And you find this not in too many institutions, these three objects, because you can see how they all three come together in this guy's outfit. Gold was also used extensively in the court, especially in Asante, where you have some of the most powerful displays of gold. But each and every one of these guys is working as an extension of the kingship, as an extension of the display that the king represents, the center. The king is at the core, that these guys are also referencing the wealth of the court. And you'll see that these swords were made to be used not as weapons, because none of them can cut. We actually did an X-ray of these swords, one of them, the ones that we have in the Detroit Institute of Art, and found out that the blade actually had cut-out motifs in them. And it was totally useless. The scabbard was also not removable. It was leather as well as fish skin on top of it. So there are layers of information that are packed into these individual swords and the motifs that they carry. And gold gives visibility to the motifs because that is the most powerful statement that is being made. And as you can see compare the king of Asante's number of swords around him with the village chief that I showed earlier on, and you see that the the size of the court sometimes is reflected in the amount of regalia that is displayed. The Queen of Asante, the Queen Mother of Asante, is a totally different entity. She is perhaps the most powerful person after the king himself. But you can see how austere the decoration of her body is, and the fact that even in on ceremonial occasions, she maintains a very, very understated demeanor in court. But one of the most important elements that I want to touch on before I end, because Costa is standing there with a bazooka in hand, is the fact that simple objects like stools have always been used in Akan culture as political emblems. If somebody tells you that they are Akan and they are also chiefs, ask them for their stool, because the stool is the primary emblem of political office in Akan culture. If they don't have a stool, they are not chiefs. And one of the things about the stool is that after a person has used it over a period of time, that person's essence literally is in the stool. And when that person passes away, the family can choose to blacken the stool, which means can create, can change the stool, that personal stool, into an object that becomes a repository for the soul of the chief. But most Akan cultures too have what they call a state stool. A state stool will usually have lots of gold on it, and you can see a Baule chief with a stool that is totally enveloped in gold. And you can see one from the Denchira area of southern Ghana with very, very austere decorations in gold. This is always, it moves from culture to culture and community to community. But what is interesting is the fact that when they call a stool a state stool, more often than not, it's a reference to the fact that that stool had been elevated to a point where it is no longer having any practical function, no utilitarian function, nobody sits on it. Rather, it is supposed to be a symbol of state, a symbol, of the spirit of the state. And that is the reason why the golden stool is so important in Akan culture. The stool that we saw previously, the Baule chief, perhaps is even trying to copy the Akan model, the Asante model, where you have, this beautiful stool considered to be, to have come down from the skies on a Friday, and rested on the lap of the first king of the Asantes, Osei Tutu, is said to be a stool that has so many wonderful, mysterious qualities to it. The fact is that it's made from cast gold, and therefore it is an object that really captures the essence of Akan leadership. There are three elements that one needs to keep in mind at this stage. The fact is that Akan chiefs believe in accumulation of wealth. Accumulating the wealth is so critical because when you accumulate wealth, you also have to display the wealth. If you don't display the wealth, then what is the purpose of accumulating? And then, when you accumulate and you display wealth, there is a moral responsibility on the part of the chief or the king to make sure that that wealth is redistributed in society. And the king of Asante represents all those three. The fact is that at the lowest levels of leadership, you have those three principles operating, but at the highest level of leadership in Asante kingship, you see it even in more profound ways. And that here is why it's very, very important for us to keep in mind. And the historian, Tom McCaskey, actually made reference to those three principles. And also, he made reference to the fact that those three principles that guide Akan leadership display of gold is something that is embedded in the use of a very, very, very important item, which is the elephant tail fly whisk. an otherwise nondescript item of regalia that communicates the economic power of the kings. And I'm just going to tell you something. It's very, very funny, but it's also very, very important. It has to do with the fact that the Akan, the Asante especially, connect gold with elephant tail, because the elephant and the Asante also connect the feces or excrement with wealth. And the elephant is such a huge animal. When the elephant eats a lot, that accumulates, it is also naturally the same animal that will defecate a lot. So the fly whisk is said to be so critical in really driving home the fact that the king or the chief, the big chief who carries one, and you have very few chiefs actually carrying the elephant tail. When they carry it, they are out to drawing attention to themselves as extremely wealthy, extremely capable of accumulating, extremely capable of displaying and redistributing. I'm not saying literally, but redistributing, the wealth through the backside of the elephant. And one of the things I would like to end on is the fact that we've seen how gold has been used extensively in Akan courts. We've seen how gold started off as part of personal regalia in the early 15th, 16th, 17th centuries when Europeans contacted the Akan. And that practice went on throughout the 19th century. However, in 1900 or around 1902, the British decided to demonetize gold, which means that gold could no longer be used as a medium of exchange in Ghana and elsewhere in the colony. And as a result, the gold weights that we saw earlier became totally useless to them. And that's why you see gold weights all over the place, including those that are being made for tourists. But the bottom line is that the Akan did not stop using gold to reference or to refer to the leadership's capacity to accumulate and to express its economic power, because gold continues to be exploited in Akan culture today. In fact, in Ghana, we have the menace of illegal mining of gold, which has left potholes all over the Akan area, and it's becoming an environmental disaster. But I would like to stop here and ask for questions. I hope I did not drive you crazy today.
And then, Nii, if anybody has a question, raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone so that everybody can get it. Liz, you'll get down there.
Hello. My question is about the purity of the gold they would use. Would there ever be instances of less wealthy villages adding other types of less precious metals to the gold to make it appear that they have a larger accumulation, or is it important to keep it 100% pure gold?
There's no 100% pure gold in Asante or in the Akan area. The fact is that they've been alloying gold for a long time. And as we get increasingly closer to the present, we see more and more gold that has more alloy in it than gold. And in fact, about 5 years ago, a dealer called me all excited, saying, I need to show you this. The DI needs to buy this object. And I said, no, curb your enthusiasm. But he still came. He drove all the way down. I went to his hotel, saw the piece, and realized, as soon as he showed it to me, and it wasn't even cast gold. It was, something with gold, what he considered to be gold leaf. And I just took 1 penny out of my pocket and scraped a little bit of it. It turned out the whole object was covered with ziggurat wrappings. And he thought he had gold in his hands. So it just tells you that it is not so much the gold that you have in hand now. It is the display potential. If you can, at least nobody goes into a festival and goes to ask the chief, can I touch your gold to make sure it's... You might get a broken nose doing that. But the point is that from afar, gold plays quite beautifully against the sun. And so everything looks golden to you. And nobody really questions whether the gold is real or not. The bottom line is the king looks beautiful. The courtiers look fantastic. It reflects the wealth of the entire community, and that is good enough. But when they go home, they know exactly what they have. And I think that some of the lower-end chiefs are resorting to that sort of behavior, and nobody frowns on it. You know what you have. If you have an empty pocket, but you want to shout at the top of the mountain that you have more money than the whole world, more grease to your elbows, you can go ahead and do it, but you are the one who is going to starve. So, yeah. Next question.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's one behind you.
Are there other areas of the world? Hi.
Right here.
Are there other areas of the world that have rich gold deposits and similar cultural uses that the Akan developed?
I don't know of any. I think India is quite close to that, and but I think that mostly in the Akan area, the Akan neighbors, and I'm a Ga. I'm from Accra, and because I'm from Accra, we value beads more than gold. And our leaders, when you give them gold, especially in the past, in pre-colonial times, they quickly used the gold to do other things. They never wore the gold because of religious reasons. So I grew up not around gold, I grew up around beads and the religious significance of beads and the fact that beads imbue you with spiritual essence that is just as powerful as gold. So the Akan people, they believe in display. They believe in display, and you just have to go to Kumasi and see how they display wealth. Not always in gold, in cars, in the Rolls Royces. The number of Rolls Royces that are owned by Ghanaians, located in the Asante region, is quite substantial. They are the ones who have the wealth, and they go out of their way to demonstrate that wealth, no matter what. So we appreciate them because they bring tourists to the country, and we all make money. Yeah.
Thank you. I've traveled in Ghana. It's indeed a beautiful country. I have a two-part question for you. One, what impact did slavery have on the gold trade and on the Akan Empire? And the second question, not related to the first, is what expression of West African art have you found in the Americas?
What expression?
Yes, so we know that there's been a lot of back and forth between West Africa and the Americas. So I'm wondering, what expressions of art have you seen in the Americas that originated in West Africa?
Well, I would just say that Akan expansionism, the fact that they try to engulf the neighbors, was actually driven partly by gold and slaves. They had gold already, but there was additional gold in neighboring areas, and getting slaves was one way by which they could engage Europeans on the coast, and trading slaves sometimes meant that they were paid in gold, and that is why the British actually wanted to appropriate as much gold as possible when they conquered Asante. But one of the interesting things that you brought up, and I forgot to mention, is the fact that when you look at the use of gold trinkets and other stuff by hip-hop artists, the bling actually started in Ghana, probably. And I wouldn't doubt it, because the fact is that when you see how much gold people wear here, I'm not saying that it started from Ghana, but I think that the use of gold in Ghana perhaps inspired the use of gold in the Americas too, especially among African Americans who value the history associated with statecraft and state formation and kingships in Africa, especially in the Akan. Yep.
Hello. My question is a broad history question in terms of pre-colonial Ghana and British-controlled Commonwealth Ghana and post-British control Ghana. Have you noticed a reverting back to pre-colonial Ghana in terms of the history and their affinity for gold?
You want me to? Please ask a question again.
The question is, have you noticed any pattern of a return to their pre-colonial history in terms of affinity for gold and the religious significance of it and anything else? Have they gone back to what they had of their ancestors before the colony?
Yeah, I think that pre-colonial Akan society is never coming back. But I think that what we are seeing is the Akan's adaptation to the new circumstance, to modernizing influences. What I've realized is that the Akan have been very, very, very skillful in navigating both the traditional and the modern in very, very, in very powerful ways, in the sense that you have people sitting in big offices in Accra, who are entrepreneurs, who are even pastors in churches. Just watch on Friday afternoon, and you see them get into their cars. They put on the cloth, toga style, and suddenly the suit is gone, the cloth is back on, because many Akans are really, really tied to tradition, and they know when it is important for them to showcase that portion of their culture. So they are not really giving up anything. What they are doing is knowing exactly when to tap into that tradition and to make it, to make it relevant in that moment. And then when it's over, they go back. That's why we always say that if you want to see Akan culture, go to a funeral, because that's when you see people you will never even recognize your CEO, totally transformed, with a cloth around his waist, bare-chested, dancing in front of a crowd. It's amazing. I can't do it, but they do it, and they do it with considerable enthusiasm. So I think that you've asked a very, very important question, but it's something that's happening in a lot of African cultures. The fact that they are able to balance the two quite well. They know exactly when to show up for the white man's work, and then they unpack all the regalia for that, and then they end up in the traditional ceremony, knowing very well that people are going to be reading what they are wearing, and they are going to be interpreting it the traditional way. So sometimes you walk in there and you're wearing a suit, they'll say, "Hey, Kwame, what's wrong with you? I mean, are you not normal? You are coming to this place and you are wearing a suit?" So there are difficulties, that people who want so badly to show their Western side can sometimes encounter problems. But it doesn't mean that when you dress down or you dress up to be in traditional attire, you are taking anything away from you. It's just a question of context. And the context is very important because the display is also very important. Because people are reading the ring that you're wearing, the cloth, the type of cloth you're wearing, the designs in the cloth, the sandals you're wearing, and sometimes even the hairstyle that you're wearing. It's all very, very, very carefully orchestrated, choreographed, and it's Akan. That's why we love them. Yes? Any more questions? Yes?
I think this will be our last question, and then we're out of time.
Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. I would like to give you a chance to choose which question you would like to answer. The first question is, I saw that there was some kente cloth in one of the images. I'm not sure if it was the Asante hene, but I'm wondering if you could talk about gold in textiles. And my second question, which you might prefer, is if you could talk to us about the other metal of brass or copper and the importance of copper or brass also in the West African context. So please take your choice.
Okay. Yellow in kente is a reference, sometimes it refers to gold, but it doesn't always, refer to gold. It depends on which gold. The fact is that kente cloth, especially kente that is woven for royalty, especially those members of the Oyoko clan, who are generally, the ones who inherit political office at the highest level. Those members have a particular cloth, which is red, yellow, and green. And yellow in that is a reference to gold, which is a reference to the wealth of the court. So that one, is understood. But yellow can be used in other contexts and might not mean a direct reference to gold. It might look like it's a reference to gold, but it might not. There are other interpretations of yellow in Akan arts that I can't go into deeply. And when it comes to brass and bronze don't measure up to gold in Akan culture especially. Brass and bronze are used for other implements, but mostly in religious circles and also for secular objects, that memorial objects for kings or chiefs or important elders can be rendered in brass. And as you can see, the gold weights are also rendered in brass. It's the most used metal in Akan culture, and it's used for a variety of purposes. You have to separate that from gold. Gold is rare. Even if you see it abundant, if you see it copiously, displayed in court art, it is still a very rare metal, and because of the rarity of it, it is prestigious to have it, and so it is not something that we can compare to brass and bronze. Brass and bronze are mostly associated with the Eastern cultures, especially in southern Nigeria, southeastern Nigeria, southwestern Nigeria, where you have Benin, Ife, and other cultures. They have valued brass and bronze for a long time. They also use it for commemorative sculpture, but they combine that with beadwork, very important beadwork. And sometimes you wonder whether the beads are more important than the brass, except that the brass sculptures were intended to be permanent representations, and therefore their durability also reflects on the durability of kingship in those cultures. I hope I answered your question. Thank you. Now can I go home?